She was born with no title, no blessings, no songs sung at her cradle, no crown waiting on a velvet cushion, just a name spoken behind hands. Bastard. A word meant to cut, meant to brand her, meant to keep her small. Her mother was no queen, not even a lady. Just a woman who caught the wrong man's eye, or maybe the right one, depending on who told the story. He was powerful, married, untouchable. And when she was born, he looked at the curve of her mouth, the eyes too much like his own, and turned away. She was raised in silence, a stone house at the edge of court, close enough to see the processions, but never invited. She watched through curtains. She memorized the colors of the banners. She knew the names of the nobles, but no one knew hers. They said bastards should be grateful, that being acknowledged at all was a gift. She was taught to speak only when asked, to curtsy deeper than others, to smile even when it burned. And from the age of 5, she understood something most grown men never did. You can survive anything if you learn to listen. So she listened to the guards outside the great halls, to the gossip of seamstresses, to the nervous laughter behind closed doors. She pieced together the puzzle of power, not by being in the room, but by listening through the keyhole. And as they ignored her, they revealed themselves, because people speak freely when they believe you don't matter. By 7, she had mastered stillness. By 8, she knew how to make herself forgettable. And by 9, she had memorized every weakness in the court. Not because she planned to use them, but because she knew one day she'd have no choice. There's something dangerous about a girl who grows up watching, but never being seen. She doesn't beg, she doesn't ask, she waits. And she remembers. If you're still here, you're not just watching a video, you're listening to the rise of a girl they tried to erase. So subscribe, because history rarely writes about women like her. And even when it does, it lies. At 10, she was brought before the king. Not her father, not officially. He called her niece, offered her a place at court, but everyone knew what she was. They whispered as she walked past. The court ladies tilted their heads. The men laughed too loudly at nothing. And the king pretended not to notice, the way her eyes never looked down. They gave her dresses that didn't fit, jewels that weren't hers, lessons meant to tame her. She was expected to be grateful, to curtsy, to play the role of the harmless girl basking in borrowed grace. But she had grown in shadows, and shadows are hard to blind. She learned everything: court etiquette, genealogy, the histories they taught boys and told girls to ignore. She studied by candlelight, late, alone, unnoticed. She memorized the faces of men who made laws, and the faces of women who broke them quietly. She learned that power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore patience. Sometimes it wore silence. Sometimes it wore a bastard's name. By 11, she knew how to make herself invisible. Not by hiding, but by becoming too ordinary to notice. She laughed when it was safe. She danced when expected. She smiled when it cost her nothing. But behind her smile, she was mapping the court. Which lords drank too much? Which ladies hated one another? Which knight always stood near the door? And which always faced away from it? She understood something few did. Secrets weren't stolen. They were offered to the ones people believed couldn't use them. So she collected every word, every glance, every misstep. And still, They called her harmless. They dressed her in silk, but not in status. They called her clever, but never legitimate. Because no matter how much she learned, no matter how gracefully she moved, she was still that word. Bastard. Unfit to rule. Unfit to marry well. Unfit to inherit. But in private, they began to notice the Duchess once caught her correcting a steward's math. A bishop caught her quoting scripture more accurately than he did. An advisor asked her opinion on a minor matter, and she offered a solution better than his own. They called it luck. They called it precocious. But they didn't forget, because power recognizes itself, even when it's dressed in a girl they were told to overlook. At 13, the king summoned her. Alone. No chaperones. No guards. Just the two of them. And a chessboard. He pointed to the Black Queen and said, "She's the only piece with true freedom. She moves wherever she pleases, but only after everything else is set in place." Then he moved his white king forward, clumsily, and smiled. She didn't. She picked up the queen, moved it silently across the board, and said nothing, because she knew that true power speaks least. And when she left the chamber, the king turned to his steward and said, "She'll be trouble." He was right, but not yet. Not loudly. Not where anyone could see. She returned to the court with more eyes on her. More invitations. More suspicion. So she adapted. Again. She became what they wanted, but only on the surface. Sweet. Obedient. Grateful. She let them underestimate her, because that was her camouflage. And beneath it, she sharpened every edge of herself. She learned languages. She copied treaties. She memorized trade routes and tax codes. She walked the gardens with noble sons and learned which ones stuttered when they lied, which ones made promises they didn't intend to keep, which ones feared their fathers, and which ones feared her. They didn't say it aloud, but it showed in their eyes. A flicker, a hesitation, a pause just before speaking. Because deep down, they sensed it. That this girl, the one born on the wrong side of the bedchamber, was no pawn. She was the queen on the board, moving unseen, until the checkmate was hers. Because this is the kind of story they never told you in school, and the kind you'll never forget. By 14, marriage was expected. Not love, not partnership, a union, a contract, a cage with prettier bars. The offers came. A viscount, a baron's son, even a prince from a neighboring realm. Each man smiling too widely. Each family hoping to bind her usefulness to their name. But she refused. Not with rebellion. Not with tantrums. With silence. She delayed. She deflected. She charmed. And in private, she said to her mother, the only soul who'd ever truly seen her, "They want me for what I might become, not for who I am, so I'll become more than any of them expect." And she did. Without a wedding, without a title, without permission. She became essential. The court started asking for her counsel. The nobles started copying her manners. The scribes began recording her suggestions without knowing whose words they truly were. She didn't need the king's seal. She became the seal, the one that mattered, the one that lasted, the one that wrote history without ever touching a pen. At 15, she stood beside her half-sister at a feast in the winter court. It was supposed to be her sister's celebration. An alliance sealed, a future secured. But the room watched her, not with affection, not even with approval, with calculation. They watched how she held her goblet, how she nodded without speaking, how one word from her made a nobleman rethink his story. They whispered, but they didn't know what to say because no one had told them that power could wear pearls instead of armor, that it could tilt its head and unmake a man's pride with nothing but a glance. That night, a duke leaned close to her and muttered, "You could have any man in this hall if only you were born right." She looked at him, calm, cold, and whispered back, "Then perhaps it's a good thing I wasn't, because if I were born right, you'd already be gone." The duke laughed, too loudly, too nervously, and left early. He never returned to court again. No scandal, no public disgrace, just a quiet retirement, and a rumor that the girl he mocked knew more than she let on. Because by now, the court had learned something it never wanted to admit. There are queens who wear crowns, and there are queens who decide who gets to wear them. She was the latter, and she didn't need to be announced. Because when she entered a room, silence walked in before her, and people stood straighter, not from respect, but from fear they couldn't name. She'd become the woman even men with titles asked for permission. And still, there was no title, no coronation, no golden ring to mark her as royal. Because she didn't rise by birthright. She rose by observation, by restraint, by outlasting every man who thought she was decoration. And when those men disappeared, no one looked too closely. Because everyone in court had learned, it wasn't the king who had the last word. It was the girl he once tried to hide, the bastard who rewrote the rules. And in case you're still watching, remember this: you don't have to be crowned to be obeyed. Tap subscribe if you believe the sharpest minds often wear the softest voices, and that true power isn't always announced. She knew. It was a test, one of many. She passed it before the ink dried. Revenues increased, corruption fell, trade improved, and nobles stopped asking if she'd marry, because now they feared she wouldn't. She became a storm no one wanted to provoke. The daughter who couldn't inherit, but who controlled the inheritance. The girl born to a mistress, who now dismissed others without lifting her voice. She had learned to wield power without ever holding a sword, because the sharpest blade in the castle was her silence. And she used it brilliantly. At 17, the king fell ill. Not gravely, not fatally, but long enough for the vultures to circle. Advisors, cousins, foreign dignitaries with offers in gold. Everyone wondering, if he died, who would rise? And in the shadows of that question, she moved. Not loudly, not with declarations, with letters, with allies, with promises made in silence and collected without blood. The court prepared for chaos, but none came, because one by one, the contenders stepped back. Not because they lost, because they understood. She had already won. When the king recovered, he called her to his chamber, alone. He didn't thank her, he didn't flatter her. He just looked uneasy, because for the first time, he realized she was no longer a child in his debt. She was the shadow behind his throne. And if he ever forgot that, the realm might not. That night, he issued a decree, one that made no mention of her birth, no mention of her title, just her name and an order. She is to be consulted before any matter of state. The courtiers called it an honor, a gesture, symbolic. But those who understood power knew what it truly was: recognition. The bastard had become the voice behind the king. And kings, they come and go. But whispers last generations. You're still watching, still listening. And that matters. Because women like her, they were never meant to be remembered. History prefers its queens crowned, its daughters obedient, its bastards silent. But she was none of those. She was sharp. She was constant. She was deliberate. And now, she is legend. So if her story moved you, if you felt the shiver of her rise, the ache of her silence, the triumph of her gaze, tap like to honor her name. Subscribe to this channel, because behind every crown, there's a story they tried to bury. And comment below with one word that describes her. Because even now, centuries later, we are still naming her, still reclaiming her, still telling the story they never wanted told. She had no statue, so we built her one out of voice. No history book, so we carved her name into memory. No crown, but every head bowed when she passed, because fate gave her nothing, but she made herself everything.